My wallet is almost always empty. In fact, because my family just will say, "Oh, Dad, have you got any? It's just an open wallet." And I don't know whether you feel like you never have quite enough. Often we feel like, in terms of money, that if we had a little bit more, we'd be okay. Or maybe you're in a position where you're quite comfortable, or you have, well, I've heard one person say they've got too much. That's very unusual. But one of the marks of a disciple is that they have the right outlook on money. And the hallmark of a disciple we've looked at in recent weeks, some of the hallmarks we've looked at so far have been that they enjoy a relationship with Jesus, they love one another, they serve willingly, but also today we're looking at that they give generously and cheerfully. I want to encourage you to bear with me as we talk about money. Sometimes people don't like to talk about that in church, but I think we very much need to speak about it. We talk about it a lot in our families and in our homes, in our workplaces. It's only right that we should talk about it in church. I guess I started in my life at the stingy end of the spectrum. If you've got stingy and generous, either end of the spectrum, I'm much further down the stingy end of the spectrum, whereas Christy, my wife, is much further up at the generous end. And so that's been a lovely thing for me to just experience and see how a generous person operates. And she's actually brought me much further up the scale, which I'm really encouraged and pleased about. Jesus speaks a lot about money, and one of the places he speaks about it, I want to read these verses, and he says it this way: "Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." You know, in the UK, we are a very wealthy nation. If you have a secure place to live, if you have clean water, if you have food, if you have access to healthcare, you are one of the richest people on the planet. According to the World Health Organization, a third of the world's population does not have access to safe drinking water. Yet we are so blessed in the UK. And sometimes we can feel like we're not very wealthy because we compare ourselves with other people that are very much more wealthy than we are. But in absolute terms, you and I are wealthy. Paul in the New Testament, who was one of the early church leaders, was writing to effectively his young apprentice leader as he was setting out to lead other churches. And he gave him this advice. He said, "Command them," that's the people in the churches, "to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." I love that phrase, that we should take hold of the life that is fully life. I guess we all want that, but we don't necessarily associate it with an attitude of generosity with our money. We can sometimes feel like, I deserve this. I've worked for it. I've earned it. I'm not giving it away. It's hard earned, that income, those savings, those investments that I have. In the Old Testament, we read this in Deuteronomy: "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth." So how should Christians, how should we as disciples handle our money? I want to just lay out a couple of simple things about that. The first thing to do is the Bible teaches us to tithe. And many of you I know will be tithing. Tithing simply means giving a tenth. It means a tenth of our income back to the church. In the Old Testament, it says into the storehouse. The storehouse was the place where spiritual strength was provided and cover was provided from. The storehouse in the Old Testament was a place of home, a place where people had their spiritual roots. So we're encouraged to tithe. As a church, we believe in tithing. It's the right thing to do. Christian and I have tithed all of our married life, and we tithed before we were married, in fact. And it's the first thing that we do. So actually for us, we have standing orders set up so that we give before we even see our money. It's gone. The tithe is gone at the beginning of the month. And then the next thing is to meet our physical and practical needs. Your home, your food, the clothing, the things that you need to have to live and survive. And then the next thing that you do is for some things of enjoyment, to be able to go out for a coffee, to be able to do things, and to have some opportunity to save some things for the future, to plan ahead. But then we should use what we have to not just our tithe and our living expenses and to save, but then to be generous, and to be generous both to others, maybe it's to charities or to people in need, or to bless our friends. So this is the pattern for a disciple, that we give, and we give cheerfully, that we don't hold on to everything, that we don't try and accrue loads, but that we are people who receive and therefore we give. Everything has come from God, therefore we're willing to give firstly from the first of everything back to God, this percentage of 10% back to God. And then out of that, the rest that remains, the 90% that we're left with, we meet those other needs, but we have a generosity of heart. Jesus speaks about priorities in the incredible teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. And these are the words he uses. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And he goes on to say, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." In the New Testament, there's many places where the people in the churches are taught about generosity. One of the passages about New Testament church living that I've spoken about a number of times, and will continue to do that, is the early church in Acts 2, at the end of the chapter. They were just so willing to sell their possessions and to give as anyone who had need. Churches in different parts of the region would help to provide and meet the needs of those that were struggling in other parts of the region. Gifts would be sent from people, individuals or churches to those who had need. When I visited Uganda a number of years ago, and I remember one of the pastors there speaking about giving, and he was in a rural church setting. And he said, if a man has two shirts and his brother doesn't have, not his physical brother, but his Christian brother doesn't have a shirt, then I would teach them to give that other shirt. It's a challenge to think that if you only have two shirts, you feel like you've not got very much at all, but to be willing to give it away. This is the principle of being part of church family, to being part of the Christian family, that we don't hold on to everything when we see need, but that we meet that need out of what we have. And God blesses us. When I speak about tithes and sometimes as well giving offerings and gifts, etc., there can be this feeling that we do it because we are being asked to do it. No. In the New Testament, the challenge for us in our way of life is to do it because we want to do it, of generosity, to reposition ourselves with that attitude. There's also an area of teaching that can sometimes creep into the church, not our church, but churches globally. And that is that you give because God asked you to give, and you are going to get something back because you've given. God does bless us when we give. God is generous to us. But the motive is never that we give to get. The motive is never that we sow into something so that we will receive something back. There are programs on the TV and they encourage you to send in money. And they say, you sow into this ministry or you sow this money into this appeal, and God will meet your need and bless you 3 times, 10 times, 100 times over. And so people will send in money out of debt because they are in debt, hoping that they will then receive something back to get them out of debt. It's like spiritual gambling. If I put that coin in the slot, I'll get some return out of it. If I place that bet, I'll get some return out of it. That's not the pattern that we see. We give out of a generosity of heart, out of what we've been given. And we don't expect anything in return. The truth is often we do get blessed. God is just so generous. He's our Father after all, and he loves us. Another place in the New Testament speaks about the nature of how we should give. And it talks about giving cheerfully. In fact, the word means hilariously. It's giving with laughter. You can't do something begrudging if you're laughing. There's something of the nature of our heart that needs to influence the way that we give. And ultimately, it's because it's heaven's pattern. This is kingdom's pattern. If we believe that God is our Father, that he provides everything that we have, that he knows what we need before we ask, then we can become a conduit for his blessing to flow through to other people. So as we've received, we pass it on to bless other people. That doesn't mean that we live in poverty. I'm not saying that. But it does mean that when we see a need, if we're able to help meet it, then we would do that. Does it mean you can't have a nice holiday or a nice car? It doesn't mean those things. But if you're pursuing those things at the expense of everything else, then our values have got out of kilter with what the Bible teaches. This message is a difficult message in some ways because it touches on what is important. We all need money to live. We think sometimes that the church doesn't have a right to speak into these subjects, but actually Jesus speaks very, very much into these subjects. He says you can't serve God and money. One of them is going to be your master. The question is, which one is it? I know that I want to be honouring God with all that I am and all that I have materially as well. And I trust that as we work through this journey of becoming better disciples, followers of Jesus, that we will learn what it really means to give cheerfully, alongside all the other hallmarks as well.